The views expressed on the Final Straw Radio do not necessarily reflect those of Asheville FM, Friends of Community Radio, or any of the affiliate radio stations airing the show. Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM-LP at 103.3 FM in Asheville, North Carolina, this is The Final Straw, and I'm William Goodenough. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. Also, if you're interested in rebroadcasting any episode or segment of the show, you're free to do so. Just send us an email if you end up using any content. You can find radio-friendly versions of this show of 59 minutes in length by visiting archive.org and searching for the collection called The Final Straw. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw, care of Asheville FM, 864 Haywood Road, Asheville, North Carolina, 28806. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville, specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.
In this week's episode of The Final Straw Radio, we feature 3 segments on 2 subjects. This week, there will be no Sean Swain segment due to technical difficulties, but we hope to be hearing his clarion call towards dancing around the ashes of swivelization next week. In part 1, I spoke with Friday, a former J20 defendant and supporter of the remaining 59 facing charges. We talked about arrests, the case so far, what we saw come out of the first trial group in November of last year, and the upcoming trial date set for April 17, 2018. On Monday and Tuesday, April 2nd and 3rd, there will be a call-in campaign for the U.S. Attorney Liu to drop J20. And on Tuesday, April 10th, there's a call for a day of solidarity with the J20 defendants. More info on both of those can be found in the episode show notes or up at defendj20resistance.org, along with printable PDFs, plus ideas for solidarity actions alongside the numbers and scripts for the call-in campaign. In part 2 of this episode, we'll be airing a statement from number 24 of The Hot Wire. Here you'll hear LX, an anarchist and sex worker in the Midwest, where they'll talk about their perspectives about the impacts of the SESTA and FOSTA acts, as well as views of recent struggles among strippers in New York City, New Orleans, and Richmond, Virginia. Tools sex workers have made for themselves to share information, as well as words of encouragement for sex workers and ways that non-sex workers can offer solidarity. You can find a full transcript of what LX has to say alongside the rest of Hot Wire's episode, which we recommend you give a gander and listen to at crimethink.com/podcast. The Hot Wire is a weekly anarchist podcast that is, as Rebel Girl says, radio ready. Following LX's breakdown of the law and some of their views around it, you'll hear William Buddington in the inaugural episode of Season 2 of the occasionally weekly tech podcast from an anarchist perspective, Era 451. William, a tech expert and trainer who is employed by the Electronic Frontier Foundation, breaks down the development of SESTA and FOSTA, which LX spoke about, and which are awaiting Trump's signature to pass into law. The bills were posed as anti-sex trafficking and human trafficking laws. However, William argues, as do many groups who fight against sex trafficking in the U.S., plus consensual sex workers like LX and their advocates, that FOSTA will hurt adults engaging in erotic services and drive them into the shadows, where they in fact face more dangers. In fact, even the U.S. Department of Justice has warned that the act will make finding and prosecuting actual human traffickers much, much harder. Though there will be some overlap in what's said between LX and William, we wanted to keep both the presentations intact. A quick announcement about former Black Panther and political prisoner Herman Bell. Herman has been in prison for 45 years for the killing of 2 police officers during his time with the Black Liberation Army. He has expressed remorse for the killings, and family members of one of the dead cops has expressed that they want Herman released. Herman has been granted parole to be released on April 17th, but there has been a pushback by the Policemen's Benevolent Association in New York State, and they've been backed by Mayor de Blasio and Governor Cuomo in attempting to block Herman's release. If you want to help press back and push for Herman Bell's release, you can do 3 things right now to support Herman. You could call New York State Governor Cuomo's office now at 518-474 518-474-8390. That's 518-474-8390. You can email Governor Cuomo's office with a script saying something like, Governor Cuomo, my name is so-and-so, and I am a resident of New York State, or another country. I support the parole board's decision to release Herman Bell and urge you and the board to stand by this decision. I also support the recent appointment of new parole board commissioners and the direction of the new parole board's regulations, which base release decisions more on who a person is today than on the nature of their crime committed years ago. Returning Herman to his friends and family will help to heal the many harms caused by crime and decades of incarceration. The board's decision was just, merciful, and lawful, and it will benefit our communities and New York State as a whole, unquote. Or you can tweet Governor Cuomo with the following sample tweet, for instance, at NY Governor Cuomo. That's Cuomo. Stand by the parole board's lawful and just decision to release Herman Bell. At 70 years old and after more than 40 years of incarceration, his release is overdue. Hashtag bring Herman home. Before we start, we want to share the great news that we can now be heard on Mondays at 8 p.m. on the airwaves of KRJF LP on 92.3 FM in Santa Rosa, California. We can also be heard on Sundays on WSFM LP in Asheville, Mondays on KWRK in Fairbanks, Alaska, and KWTF in Bodega Bay, Tuesdays on KOWA LP in Olympia, Washington, and Sundays at WCRS in Columbus, Ohio. If you're hearing the show and want it up on your local airwaves, please consider visiting our website and checking the radio broadcasting link for details and ideas about how you can make that happen. The more stations that take up our free radio show on their airwaves, the more people get to hear the voices that we're presenting and amplifying. We'd like to recommend that if you appreciate The Final Straw, you can show that appreciation by sharing the show with your friends. We are on all the crappy social networks out there, after all. By rating us on iTunes, by sending us an email or a letter with suggestions and feedback, and also by making a one-time donation via PayPal or a recurring donation via Patreon. Your donations help us to pay for equipment and attend events like the upcoming A-Radio gathering in Germany, from which we'll surely bring you voices that you won't hear elsewhere on the airwaves. More info about how you can donate is up at our website, thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org/donate. Thanks, and have a great week. So it's been more than a year since the mass arrest at the inauguration of President Trump in Washington, D.C. On January 20th, 2017, protests rocked cities around the country. In D.C., you may have heard, thousands took to the streets, and around 200 were kettled and mass arrested at 12th and L early in the day. We're here to chat about where the case is at right now. Would you care to introduce yourself for the listeners?
Hi, my name is Friday, and I am a former defendant of the J20 case in Washington, D.C.
So can you give us a quick recap on what charges people got from that mass kettle and how the state strategy was when it began?
Sure. Okay. So on the day of, 230 people were rounded up in a kettle, which is the police tactic in which the cops just surrounded a group of people and just pretty much just try to catch anybody who's in like a certain physical proximity. Those 230 people included protesters, medics, journalists, and legal observers. We were held for a total of 36 hours. People were held out on the street for a good 12 hours before they were put into paddy wagons. So we were then released 36 hours after being kettled the morning of January 20th. And we were given one felony count at the time, which was rioting felony that turned out doesn't actually exist as a felony in Washington, D.C. So then in April of 2017, it got down to closer to 220 people, and through a superseding indictment, which our charges were given through a grand jury process, we were all facing at least 8 felonies, which included property destruction, riot, and incitement to riot.
So can you tell listeners what happened with the first group that actually went to trial and which appeared to send the prosecution in a kind of a tailspin?
Sure. So before we actually get to the trial that started on November 15th, 2017, I just want to make a note that it's pretty remarkable that 194 people out of originally 230 who were arrested agreed to go to trial and they not take a plea deal. It's like pretty astounding because the vast majority of felony cases end up in a plea deal. So 6 people agreed to take an early trial slot in November of 2017, which was really a beautiful, amazing act of solidarity to go up against the first trial in which, like, you don't really know what's going to happen. That was a really big mark of solidarity on behalf of those people. So that trial took about 6 weeks, ended end of December 2017 to full acquittals.
That's awesome, and I think it is really important that you bring up. I kind of took that for granted for a second, but that many people, especially out of the total that we're going to, like the state was going to try to prosecute, all coming deciding to take it to trial. A majority of those people deciding to sign on to a collective defense statement of not throwing the other co-defendants underneath the bus, and then having seeing legal frameworks or legal defense frameworks at a movement level come together in kind of this way that was really clearly written about in the Tilted Scales Guide as a proposal. It is really cool to see all these different talents and people come together from different directions and do this mass defense thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was a little over 130 of us wrote and then agreed to what we call the points of unity, which were 6 points that, as you said, essentially agreed to not cooperate with the state and not do anything that could hurt each other's cases, which didn't mean that people who took plea deals wouldn't be supported, but that in doing so, we agreed to not do anything that could hurt anybody else. That took a lot of work, and it really would not have been possible without a very strong sense of solidarity among defendants and also just really broad network of support for defendants, which I also want to note that was really incredible because we didn't know each other, all these defendants, and people are scattered across the country, and so for people to make that commitment to each other is really, really amazing.
And noted also that the people deciding not to throw each other under the bus or not to build a self-defense based on throwing blame or shade on another one of the defendants. That seemed at least in the first trial group, that it was the kind of thing that even with some of the best intentions of public defenders, as the majority were, they still kind of, there were a few instances where defense lawyers would have to would fall back into that sort of well, the good protester did this thing and this is my client, as opposed to these bad ones, and kind of point to things that the prosecution was pointing towards the other defendants. And it seemed like the defendants in that first round did a pretty good job of trying to refocus their lawyers back in towards the collective defense and backpedal from those specific comparisons. Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah, it does. I think they did a really good job, all things considered, and with the time crunch. But yeah, absolutely, the good protester, bad protester narrative came up in the first trial.
So after the first trial group, the prosecution, which is overseen indirectly by the Trump administration, had to shift their approach towards the case. Can you talk about what changes happened after the first group went to trial? Well, first, can you say what happened in terms of the jury with the first trial group, and then can you talk about changes in approach that the state made towards the remaining defendants?
Sure. So after about 5 weeks of trial, all the closings wrapped up, and the jury deliberated for 2 or 3 days, and they came back and they delivered full acquittals, which was really incredible. It was really great to sit in a room while Kirchhoff had to hear the words "not guilty" 42 times. I felt like a really great victory. So that was really great. As I said before, it was a really big risk for those 6 defendants and really disruptive to their lives to have to take like 6+ weeks off their everyday lives to come live in DC essentially, and fight this case. What Kirchhoff had decided to do originally was for the trial group after N15, they were going to bring those 6 to 8 defendants, I can't remember how many, but they were going to bring those to a bench trial. They had dropped all their charges to misdemeanors. And that was supposed to happen at the end of 2017. So that to us indicated that the prosecution essentially was just kind of like experimenting. The goal of this is to get as many convictions as possible. And so like having the next trial group like right after this one go to a judge instead of having a jury trial seemed like just like an experiment to see like what was going to work best for Kirchhoff. And then almost a year anniversary on January 18th or 19th, 129 of us had our charges dismissed, which is great for the most part. Our charges were what's called dismissed without prejudice, which means the government has 5 years to recharge us with any or all of these charges. And like the parameters around that aren't really clear for when and why they might do that. So that to me just seems like a really great way to continue to disrupt different social movements, is to have 129 people just have these like
potential charges hanging over their heads. Like that's incredible.
Yeah, for 5 years. So there could literally be a new president of the United States by the time like it's guaranteed that like that these won't come back and that we won't be called into court again or something.
But so that leaves how many people still facing the full brunt of charges?
There are 59 people who are still being brought to trial. The next trial starts April 17th, and the trial blocks continue all the way through the end of October 2018. That's on their current schedule. Like, delays and shifts in schedule happen all the time. So this could be going on, J20 trials could be going on for even longer than that.
Oh, you had said 42 not guilties earlier, and just for listeners who may not appreciate, that means that the jury had to decide on each charge for each of the defendants in that trial group whether or not they were guilty or innocent. Can you say a few words about the approach towards a conspiracy trial that the prosecutor Kirchhoff has been making?
Sure. It's pretty wild. Basically, this case is about making the most basic forms of protest, planning, and care criminal. So things like legal support forms, to having a time and a date for a protest, chants like whose streets, our streets, they're all being submitted into evidence as evidence of a conspiracy. One of the defendants on the N15 trial was a medic, and their actual medic bag, Kirchhoff took it apart for the jury and walked the jury through all these different elements in their bag: granola bars, tampons, Band-Aids, really basic stuff to eventually make this point that by being a medic and bringing like really basic forms of like supplies, that Britt, the defendant, was aiding in conspiracy by treating people who either like are being accused of property damage or consented to property damage simply because they were present and did not leave once property was vandalized or broken, which there was never a dispersal order. The DC police actually have standard operating procedures that were put into place because they kept getting sued so many times for unlawfully arresting people at protests, that they have like a handbook that tells them that they're supposed to give so many different dispersal orders before they can arrest people. None of that ever happened. Instead, Kirchhoff argued in court that sirens from police cars should have been enough of a dispersal warning.
So during the first trial, the prosecution had threatened but was unable to muster a so-called black bloc expert to speak on this protest tactic, meaning that the state was or leading to the fact that the state was unable to refer to people rounded up in the mass arrest as members of a black bloc, which is which is a part of the attempt of conviction for guilt by association or conspiracy that Kirchhoff and the prosecution were trying to bring. And now they're claiming that they're bringing a cop who is undercover in the New York City anarchist scene, hardcore anarchist scene or whatever, for a number of years to talk about strategic organizing among anarchists or in the build up to this protest. Can you speculate about this, or have you heard very much about this?
Yeah. So Kirchhoff filed a pre-trial motion. She filed this sometime in March of 2018 under a fake name, Julie, who is a current FBI agent who claims to have been undercover in, quote, anarchist extremist group in New York. I don't know what the that means. It could mean she maybe went to a book club one time. But she claimed to have infiltrated anarchist extremist group, which is very much part of the narrative of what Kirchhoff is trying to create right now, is that all of these protesters in this kettle are anarchist extremists, bad people who dress in black and create chaos. So Julie was also around during Occupy New York. Julie's the fake name that's provided in the motion. So she was around Occupy New York waiting for a black bloc that never materialized. And she also was present for the Pittsburgh G20. So Kirchhoff is arguing that this agent's identity should be protected so that their current investigations aren't compromised, and also claiming that there's a threat of doxing against this agent, essentially, from anarchists and anti-fascists.
The G20 at least happened in 2009, right? That's pretty intense. That was a while ago. For someone to be undercover and working with the FBI during that period of time. Man, this world has some terrible people in it. Anyway.
Yeah.
So there's another thing coming up before the trial group, like I see on the defendj20resistance.org website. There's a call-in campaign April 2nd through 3rd, which will be right as this show is airing. Do you have any information about that you want listeners to find out about?
You can find more about the call-in campaign on defendj20resistance.org, and it is another call-in campaign to drop all of the charges against the remaining 59 defendants.
Are there ways that you would suggest for people in the listening audience to get involved in supporting the J20 trial, the defendants in it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it takes so much support, either in person in court or at home bases for people to go to trial. It's people's lives are disrupted for weeks and weeks at a time. So if you have defendants in your area, ask them how you can be supportive in their everyday lives. You can have fundraisers. You can donate to our fundraiser, which again you can find at defendj20resistance.org. Solidarity demos are always appreciated and great.
So Friday, would you mind expressing to people who maybe don't know anyone in their lives who's caught up in this trial, how it's disrupted your life or the lives of people that you know who are defendants? Are there any examples, without naming names, of ways that people have had to shift their studies at school, cancel their semesters or cancel travel plans, or have had to totally restructure childcare to go out for the case, or put their lives on hold?
Yeah, so I know for me as a defendant, I didn't get anywhere near close to trial, but my life was definitely disrupted by having to go to a bunch of pretrial hearings. Commuting back and forth up to D.C. on the court schedule, having to make time to communicate with my lawyer. In terms of trial, people have to arrive before trial even starts, go to more pretrial hearings, and then, trial can go on for as long as it wants to. So you, at minimum, have to block off 2 weeks of your life to go be in a city that you probably don't live in. And this first case, it took 6 weeks. So yeah, if you have a child, you have to figure that out. If you have a job, good chance you have to put that on hold. court also does not make exceptions for people who are in school. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty intense considering like that they're trying to pin some property damage on this huge group of people that they can't even prove, like that they haven't been able to prove so far conclusively that any of the individuals they put up for trial are personally responsible for this, and they're trying to do this collective guilt thing that, as far as I'm aware, is, not considered a constitutional approach towards property destruction or what have you. I guess, do you think that there's maybe an element of, like, in the collective punishment, that there's an element of, like you mentioned, strategically taking people who may be involved in anti-authoritarian movements off of the table, at least for a little bit, but also just, like, petty revenge? I mean, during a president's inauguration, when he's already having such difficulties with his ego in terms of how many people showed up for the inauguration to support him versus how many were in the Women's March and what have you.
Yeah, I mean, it's been pretty clear from the get-go that a mass kettling was pretty politically motivated. In court, audio was played of Commander DeVille describing a group of people congregating as anarchists, and this was before the kettle was taking place. And I mean, in the past, 2 years alone, there have been so many laws and bills proposed and then passed criminalizing different forms of protest, and J20 is unfortunately just another notch in this overall plan.
Can you talk a little bit about why you think what strategy was behind narrowing the pool of defendants down so dramatically?
Sure. I mean, the last trial was obviously a really big loss for them. So what they're doing is they're narrowing down the scope of their prosecution. It takes less resources to prosecute 59 people. From the get-go, it seemed like a win, to have 129 people, including me, yay, oh my God, so many less people to worry about. This is awesome. But it's a lot easier for the government to try to lock away 59 people than 90 people that we had to start off with. So I think, for me, it seems just like another strategy to try and separate good protesters and bad protesters, and good activists and bad activists. And the fact that people are still being prosecuted means this is still a drain on all of our communities. There are still people who need to be supported. And when I know at first, there was this sense oh gosh, are these people going to have the same amount of support now that so there's so many less co-defendants, and maybe this is going to drop off the map. I think it's a really good strategy on part of the government to try and make us suspicious of each other, to just decide that a bunch of people get their charges dismissed without any one coherent, clear reason why.
Or even besides suspicion, just that the people that are remaining get kind of left behind because so many people have been taken out of the pool for support. Can you talk a little bit about what the implications of political mass arrests are for the United States? Because there hasn't been a kettling and arrest this large in, I think, a few decades.
Yes. We know that mass arrests in political situations are not unusual. What is unusual is to have this many blanket charges, especially felonies, for this many people at one given time. It was a huge leap for the government to decide, okay, 200 and some people are going to get one felony, and then, oh, okay, in a couple months, here are all these other felonies. And to basically charge 200 people with breaking the same windows.
There were a number of instances during the first round of the case where it seemed like the police commander as well as the prosecution clearly showed their own personal political biases, and also not only with words that they said or were caught on recording, but the sources that they were pulling from. Can you talk a little bit about Project Veritas and some of the conservative and reactionary positions that were taken by law enforcement and prosecutors?
Sure. So the commander was Keith DeVille, and through radio recording of the morning of J20, you can hear him refer to like the assembly of like the people he eventually kettled as anarchists. And then in court, it came up that he's actually been, I don't even know if punished is the right word, but he's been reported basically by his colleagues like multiple times throughout the years for saying homophobic, transphobic, and anti-Semitic things, which, I mean, not surprising because he's a cop, but it surprised me a little bit that this guy is like clearly like saying enough hateful things on a regular basis that even other cops are like, this is a little much. And then, so Project Veritas is known for their doctored footage, and some of their footage was submitted during this trial from J20 planning meeting.
Well, weren't they trying to undermine Planned Parenthood? They had sent in someone dressed up like a 1970s pimp into a Planned Parenthood meeting, and were apparently trying to get them to say that they would sell embryo parts from aborted fetuses. And it was obviously doctored and pretty poorly done. Yeah, and there's other shenanigans that they've done, I'm aware of, but it's all arch conservative and over the top ridiculous stuff. But they were infiltrating public planning meetings, as you said, for protests that would be happening around the inauguration in hopes of undermining the people that were doing the organizing themselves.
And it also turned out even like the MPD had also sent an undercover into planning meetings for Disrupt J20. So it shows that the cops, or that rather like the government is invested in disrupting social movements at every angle.
And yet, when they did play some of the Project Veritas videos in court, they redacted themselves the faces of, well, undercovers, but also of Project Veritas activists, right?
Yes. Which
shows a little bit of a bias that, like, you can use this stuff. And they said that they didn't actually doctor the information at all. It was a bit ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, over and over again, the question of, like, who is granted safety and anonymity comes up over and over again because people are being targeted and prosecuted for wearing masks, whereas it's important to close the identity of a FBI agent who's going to testify about the concept of a black bloc.
Too busy trying to survive capitalism's daily grind to get caught up on the latest anarchist news? Or maybe you're so wrapped up in your own organizing that it's hard to make time to hear about other liberatory struggles. This Rebel Girl has got you covered. Tune in every Wednesday for new episodes of The Hotwire, a 30-minute podcast with the latest anarchist news, on-the-ground interviews, a repression roundup, political prisoner birthdays, and announcements for upcoming events. All this and more at crimethink.com.
This town is too hot.
Hey, my name is Alex. I am an anarchist and a sex worker in the Midwest, here to talk about FOSTA and SESTA. I'm going to give you the quick and dirty version of both of these bills. There's SESTA, which is Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act, which was just recently passed in the House and the Senate. And what this bill does is it holds online platforms liable, criminally and civilly, for the content that their users post. And then we got FOSTA, which is Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, which basically conflates sex trafficking with sex work, and it makes hosting online prostitution a federal crime. Even though both of these bills haven't been signed into law yet, we're already seeing their effects spread through our communities. And what this has looked like is websites that host ads for sex workers, websites that allow sex workers to screen their clients, websites that provide forums for sex workers to communicate with one another about ways to stay safe and alive and to allow them to build community with one another, which is already so precarious and challenging, have either been shut down entirely or selectively deleted. These two bills claim to stop sex trafficking, but what they actually do is conflate sex trafficking with sex work, which again are two very different things and deserve two very different conversations. These bills are a huge threat to the sex work community because they threaten websites that allow us to work safely and independently. Let's be honest, 2,000 bills are not going to stop sex trafficking or sex work. Pushing both of these things off the internet are also not going to stop them. All it's going to do is make this extremely more dangerous for everyone who's using the internet to work safely and independently. Period. That's it. The state and police will not protect us. They're not our friends, especially as sex workers. We're often seeing violence from both the state and police. So how often are there cases of police hiring an escort, robbing them and raping them and then arresting them? I mean, the numbers are outrageous. Sex workers already know this. All marginalized people in this country already know this about both the state and the police. And even though this legislation is a huge hit to the sex worker community, we are organizing, we are resisting, we are coming together, and we're not going to stop what we're doing because of this legislation. Sex workers have always resisted, have always struggled, and this has just taken a different form currently because of the legislation at play. Thus far, what this has looked like is taking anything that's hosted online, like bad date list, blacklist, etc., and moving them onto an analog format. So compiling all of this information in case websites get shut down. There's also a redistribution of wealth and resources within the sex worker community. So by sex workers, for sex workers, which is amazing to see. So people who are hurting right now, the most in our communities, people are showing up for them either individually or through organizations that have been created. There's groups like St. James Infirmary, Red Light Legal, and a new group that just started called New Horizons, which are all focusing in different ways on redistributing both wealth and resources by sex workers for sex workers. In the past month in general, there's been huge resistance and struggle within the sex work community. We can look at the stripper strikes happening in New Orleans, in Richmond, Virginia, in New York City, which I highly encourage you to look up. It's beautiful to see sex workers come together to fight with one another, to be in solidarity with one another, and to ultimately fight against the state. I want to really emphasize that this is not just a sex worker issue. This is a labor rights issue. This is a gender issue. This is a trans issue. This is a race issue. If you care at all about police violence, if you care at all about state violence, if you care at all about prison issues, this is that. If you're a sex worker and you're listening, I love you. If you're not a sex worker, please listen to sex workers. Please show up for them. Please stand in solidarity with me and my community. What we need the most right now is financial support. So please donate to either the organizations that I mentioned previously or individual sex workers you know in your life who are struggling. We also seriously need someone who is in tech to help us advertise and take control of these platforms. So if that is you, please contact some sex worker in your life and let them know that you can make this happen for us. I just want to end with fuck the state and fuck police. They have never been on our side and they never will be. Whether you know it or not, someone you love is a sex worker. Thank you so much.
Welcome to Error 451, an occasionally weekly podcast on tech security from an anarchist perspective. I'm your host, Bursts of Goodness. Okay, we're back again with William Buddington, who is a digital security expert and trainer. William, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, it's great to be on.
So I was hoping that we could have a chat about FOSTA and SESTA, which the word about them and the effects that it's having on black market economy, including erotic work and sex work, is making the rounds in a lot of circles, including anarchist circles. Can you talk about what First off, what FOSTA and SESTA are, and when did they take effect?
So FOSTA and SESTA are a group of laws that seek to carve out additional exceptions to the Communications Decency Act, Provision 230. The CDA 230, as it's called, is viewed as the Magna Carta of the Internet, as Ellen Rosenstein has called it on the Lawfare blog. It's basically a law that exempts companies that have third parties or intermediaries posting on their site content that's generated by users. So users are posting on, say, Facebook or Craigslist content that they create. And by and large, the corporations that host these sites can't be held liable for content that isn't created by themselves, those corporations, directly, if they're coming from the users. There are certain exemptions that have been carved out during the passage of that original CDA 230 law that was passed in 1996. Those three main exceptions are federal criminal law, also intellectual property law, and Electronic Communications Privacy Act, ECPA law. These are three exceptions to CDA 230. And you'll see, for instance, on YouTube when certain video has been taken down because of infringing content. That is because YouTube, or Google in this case, that owns YouTube, has these automated content filters and are searching for content that infringes on intellectual property law. And because of that, they automatically take it down. And that's because it would have be a liability for them to keep that content up. What SESTA, which has been scrapped, and FOSTA, which has been passed, which is kind of a reformulation of SESTA. So FOSTA is the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act. And SESTA, which was a previous formulation, which they basically rewrote, was the Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act. And what these laws do is they create an additional exemption to CDA 230, which makes companies liable for, in the case of sex trafficking, knowingly assisting, supporting, or facilitating sex trafficking. And in the case of sex work, promoting sex work. So this basically, corporations will be held liable under this kind of murky wording that's been formulated under this legislation. In the debates that ensued in the formulation of this legislation, it was clear that the representatives that were bringing this up didn't really know what CDA was there to do. They thought that basically corporations that are hosting content had impunity. A lot of the targeting of FOSTA was around Backpage. And you might know Backpage.com, which had an erotic services kind of section where, there was some apparently sex trafficking happened, but there was also people that were posting advertising sex services there was consensual as well. There's a lot of scrutiny that Backpage came under, and people in the kind of formulation of the legislation, you were kind of trying to describe Backpage as not having any reins put on them, or not having any ability to not basically being under the purveyance of the law. And that's simply not true. Backpage there's a Massachusetts court case that is basically saying CDA doesn't apply to Backpage, since their technology was actually like promoting the content being created. So they say that they're not already not under Communications Decency Act 230. And additionally, there's a lot of evidence that actually, I think it was revealed that there was a federal grand jury process against Backpage as well. So they're already being targeted by prosecutors. FOSTA that was basically the whole kind of marketing or target of FOSTA was Backpage, but it's not actually going to make any different from what they're already doing. They're already taking down their erotic services section. So basically, FOSTA was a reformulation of SESTA instead of anti-trafficking laws, anti-prostitution laws. And it's a new crime that makes internet companies liable for content that's created that either in the case of sex work promotes sex work, or in the case of sex trafficking, knowingly assists, supports, or facilitates sex trafficking. And this is part of the problem, right? The conflation of these two things, conflation of sex trafficking and consensual sex work, that is completely absent from the debate or the focus when formulating this legislation. It's all completely the same to legislators, and this has kind of made it so that internet companies, when they're thinking about how do I not come under prosecution of FOSTA, by now, what FOSTA has made is that it's made state prosecutors also be able to prosecute under state laws the internet companies, which has never been the case before. As I said earlier, there's an exception or a CDA 230 under federal criminal law, but not state criminal or civil proceedings. And so this has been basically has forced internet companies to think about how they might avoid being liable under state criminal and civil law. And this has made them take over broad steps to remove any content that could perceivably be thought of as promoting sex work. So there's been really disastrous effects in the case of Craigslist, Reddit, other sex work services such as that allow sex workers to vet their clientele, such as City Vibe, The Erotic Review, Verify Him, Night Shift. All these services have been basically shut down, and this has promoted a dynamic of forcing sex workers to take their work to the streets.
It's a very complex issue that you're breaking down. I really appreciate it. But so can you, when we're talking about sex trafficking in this case, or when you mentioned earlier that the politicians that were passing this law didn't really differentiate between sex work and sex trafficking or human trafficking. Could you differentiate for listeners that may not be aware what the difference between consensual sex work is versus human trafficking?
Sure. Consensual sex work means individuals basically engaging in sexual activity in order to make their livelihoods, and consensual sex acts to make their livelihoods. This might come through some intermediary if they are part of a sex work collective or part of a some kind of either various different forms of brothels or other kind of things like
escorting
that.
agencies,
etc. And then there's, on the other hand, sex trafficking, which is basically the act of transporting individuals and also coercing individuals into sex work when they are not engaging in that voluntarily, when they're when they don't want to be doing sex work and they're forced into it. So that's kind of the distinction to be made. And sex trafficking does happen in the U.S. There are organizations that are dedicated to helping the victims of sex trafficking, many of which, in this case, have actually came out against SESTA. Freedom Network USA, for instance, is one of these organizations. The reason being is that the advertisements and online content that is being removed under FOSTA and was thought to have the effect when SESTA was up for legislation and vote, was thought to soon be under threat. And now we know that FOSTA has passed both the House and Senate. Basically, Freedom Network USA opposed FOSTA and SESTA, the initial formulation, because of the ability for this content that's being removed to identify victims. And so, even the DOJ, the Department of Justice of the USA, was warning Congress about the effect that SESTA would have on identifying victims of sex trafficking, because it'll push them underground and into situations where they're on the streets. They're more likely to be at risk of sexually transmitted diseases like hepatitis C or HIV. They also, their presence disappears, so investigators can't follow leads, for instance, on sex trafficking. So it makes the trail run cold in some ways for those that are investigating sex trafficking. So that's one of the reasons why the DOJ, for instance, in a letter to Congress, warned against this legislation. They also, in their letter, mentioned a very troublesome aspect of SESTA or FOSTA, which is that the lettering of the law stipulates that it will take effect immediately and apply to the past. So this is retroactive application of the law. That's a violation of constitutional law. That's against the ex post facto provision of the Constitution. And so they are basically saying, hey, this is unconstitutional. The DOJ is saying this. And when it's the DOJ that's trying to say, hey, look, this legislation that is meant to protect
victims of sex trafficking.
Yeah, it's being ineffective on sex trafficking. It's actually going to make the problem worse. And so, when it comes to that, you know that it's going to be when the DOJ looks like the good guys, you know that it's going to be a bad piece of legislation for everyone involved. But FOSTA, the difference between FOSTA and SESTA is SESTA is no longer a law that was reformulated into FOSTA that was brought up between before the House and Senate. And FOSTA on February 27th was the House voted 388 to 25, passing FOSTA. The Senate voted 97 to 2 on March 22nd, passing FOSTA. And currently it is going to be coming up before Trump to sign. So the president has to sign it into law. Otherwise, it goes back to Congress. But we've already seen all these sites taking down their for instance, in Craigslist case, a personal ads section. And Reddit changed their privacy policy to basically warn against people that are using it for solicitations for sex. And already these chilling effects have taken place. And it's not because of the companies that they're basically trying to protect themselves from being shut down completely. And so basically to exempt themselves from prosecution, they are more aggressively going after content that might place them under scrutiny. So there's a really good piece, a blog post under titsandsass.com from March 23rd that lets people know how they might remove content that they've made in the past, advertising, sex services, etc., in order for their accounts not to be deleted completely. Because I think that what's going to happen is companies are going to try to over-aggressively police themselves in order for them to not get sued for millions of dollars by over-aggressive prosecutors. And that's really the danger, is that states' prosecutors have been aggressively lobbying for years to scrap 230 and provisions that protect companies from them being liable for their users' postings. And this makes it so that the companies and the services that we use online are basically forced to aggressively police their content.
I guess, do you mind if I ask on record, have you ever done any sex work?
I don't mind, and no, I haven't myself.
Okay. Can you talk about, to your understanding, and hopefully we'll be able to have a wider conversation with folks that have done more of this, but you mentioned before the danger of people who are doing sex work no longer having the tools of sharing information with other folks about what might be dangerous places and who might be dangerous people who might be soliciting their skills, but actually having to go out to the streets to find employment. Can you talk about, to your understanding, what dangers to be connected with not being able to look over John's past histories or share that information with other people, or just having to go and solicit on the streets?
I mean, I can only kind of speculate based on what sex workers that I've read online have said, and kind of mirror what they've said. Is that it's going to have a completely disastrous effect. It's going to make it so that there isn't this way for them to safely interact and safely vet and communicate with others based on their experiences on how safe a John is, what encounters they've had with people in the past, methodologies on how to keep themselves safe. I mean, this is going to also make websites from the harm reduction community question whether they are able to actually operate, because an aggressive prosecutor can easily target them. So, just because of this one clause that says promoting sex work comes under FOSTA and can be subject to prosecution on the state or federal level. So yeah, it's going to have a disastrous effect, I think. I think we've already started to see some of those effects coming to bear even before it's been enacted completely. As I said, all these different sites that sex workers use to facilitate their business and keep themselves safe, they're starting to go away. It's kind of funny, and it's telling that when the erotic services section started on Craigslist, there was a 17% fall in homicide for sex workers. Sex workers face dangers out there, right? Like, they are subject to homicide at a level that's 400 times what workers on average face, according to some studies. So this is, a line of work that they rely on their experiences of others and the community to keep themselves safe. And if there isn't an online forum to keep that community and their experiences being shared, then that puts them at danger.
You mentioned that FOSTA's already passed both the houses of Congress and it's just awaiting Trump signing. And the fact that the DOJ has warned about these sorts of laws and the efficacy and the unconstitutionality of it, does that, to your mind, to speculate, tell you that it's likely that the courts will get involved and maybe stop the activation of this law, or at least pause it while it gets argued in the court system?
Yeah, I think it's likely that there'll be a court proceedings that challenge legitimacy of this law. Usually when you see court proceedings like that, they'll kind of disambiguate the law in some way, where there's ambiguous language, but they won't completely
strike it,
put a stop to it. It's not like courts aren't in that role. They don't make laws or rescind them. They interpret them, right? So that's the role of the courts, having pressure to, like most things, having pressure to highlight how this is dangerous for freedom of speech on the internet and for consensual sex work, and having a free and open forums for people to share experiences. This, I think, is requires us to kind of make a big stir about this, and to make it so that the just that be don't find it politically palatable to continue having this in place, and hopefully by highlighting these issues, by bringing it up in a way that embarrasses politicians, by saying, hey, look, you're making sex trafficking, you're not doing your job and stopping it, this is going to make it worse. That will kind of shame them into doing something that rescinds the law. But I wouldn't necessarily count on it.
Do you feel equipped to recommend autonomous ways that people can combat the situation while these rules are rolling around? I
think that one of the things you can do is find hosting providers outside the U.S. Unfortunately, if you are engaging in consensual sex work, to advertise your services. And unfortunately, I think that historically, because of CDA 230, the U.S. has been a beacon of, God, I hate saying this, a beacon of light in some ways for internet content because of this specific law, in the way that it allows companies not to be liable for the content it creates. As I said, CDA 230 was a Magna Carta of the internet in some ways, making it so that companies can develop services without fear of being prosecuted for it. This is not so much the case anymore, at least with regards to sex work, and so basically having that content hosted somewhere that's outside the U.S. makes it more safe from being taken down. It's kind of a bummer to say that, but that's the way it is right now.
Are there any, in researching this, are there any sites, like you mentioned Tits and Sass, are there any other sites or social media presences that have been enlightening that you'd suggest people follow?
I would just suggest looking for content that is specific, and from what, especially from those that are the purported, ones being protected by this legislation, because they're the ones that are actually saying the most things against it and saying that this is terrible, and highlighting those voices because they're the ones that have been left out of the conversation by and large. And
I'd like to suggest listeners listen to the March 28th episode of The Hot Wire. There's a short bit by someone who does sex work about why these bills suck so much. That was pretty enlightening and pretty thoughtful.
And for a kind of a nerdier take on it, at least in terms of, how this kind of all works within the law, there was a Tech Dirt episode, number 157, that covers a lot of this. So I recommend listening to that too.
Cool. Well, thank you, William, for doing all that research and chatting about this.
Absolutely.
If you'd like to hear more of these chats or our weekly radio show on anarchist actions and ideas, check out thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org.
Fight the planet! Hide the planet!
Shut up and get in the car!
Hide the planet! Hide the planet!